This is the only camera cage for the OM system OM-1 Mark II. It's the SmallRig 3948 half cage for the Olympus OM-1 and the OM system OM-1 Mark II. And this cage is also somewhat compatible with the EM-1 Mark III and the EM-1 Mark II. And the reason I say somewhat compatible is because there are certain things that you can't do on the EM-1 Mark II and 3. I can't remember, but I think you couldn't attach the clamp for the HDMI cable to secure it. So there are some things to keep in mind if you're using it with the older EM-1 Mark II or EM-1 Mark III. It's a half cage, so it's quite small. It weighs 120 grams. And it has plenty of 1/4 inch 20 screws, so 6 1/4 inch 20 screws on top. And it also has a 3/8 inch 16 threaded hole with 2 ARRI locating pinholes. And it has a cold shoe here, and 2 1/4 inch 20s here, and another 5 1/4 inch 20s here. Also, this is a NATO rail here, so you can attach a NATO rail handle or any accessories using NATO rail. But the top part is not NATO rail, so you just have to screw things on. The bottom part of the cage is Arca-Swiss compatible, so you can attach it to any ball head which supports the Arca-Swiss standard, which is most of the photography ball heads. But typically for video, I think most people use the Manfrotto style plates. It also has a flathead screwdriver for screwing the cage into the camera, and it's magnetic, so it stays in place. And on this side of the cage, you have a location to insert a neck strap or shoulder strap or wrist strap or whatever you want to call it, and then attach it to here. I think this is a little bit awkward because ideally you want to have the strap location at the end of the camera, not halfway through the camera. But since this is a half cage, this is the only option you get. The disadvantages of this camera cage is that it's a generic cage, so it's made for the OM-1 as well as the OM-1 Mark II and the EM-1 Mark III and the EM-1 Mark II as well. So because it's generic, they haven't been able to specifically mold it exactly to any of these cameras. So they've created something generic. So for example, the screw here on the bottom has a lot of playing room. So when the screw comes even a tiny bit loose, this moves backwards or forwards, or if you attach heavy things to it. So this is really undesirable. And the other problem with this is that typically you would have a center screw on the front and a center screw at the back, which you don't have here. So if I want to mount this on a Manfrotto plate with 2 screws, there's no real nice option to do that. So you have 2 disadvantages with this screw hole being so wide. One is that it has more play, and the other one is that you have less options for mounting it on a plate, because if there was more space here, you could add another threaded hole for attaching plates. Another disadvantage is that there's no M2.5 screw for the eyelet. So typically with the newer camera cages, they have the camera cage with a thread, so you can screw this part in so that the camera cage doesn't play in the camera, and you don't have that here, obviously, because they wanted to make this camera cage compatible with multiple cameras as opposed to one. So it's compatible with multiple cameras, but it's not perfect for any of the cameras. So missing that is also something that makes the cage move a little bit once you attach things on it. And on the bottom of cameras, you typically get these protrusions. I don't know if you can see this in the video, but you have one protrusion here, one here, and you have 2 on this side of the camera as well. But because this is a generic camera cage, they haven't been able to make use of these. So what other camera cages do is have a tiny indentation where these should be, so that the camera sits lower down in the camera cage and there's no space between the camera and the cage. Whereas with this, there's some space between the camera and the cage and you can see through it. And another disadvantage of this cage is that there's no padding inside the cage. So if it touches the camera, then there wouldn't be anything to protect the camera. Now, another disadvantage of this cage again is that because it's a half cage, there's nothing on the right hand side. So you can't attach a grip or anything on the right hand side. So if you wanted to attach something on the right hand side like a grip, you would have to attach something on top and then kind of have something go across and then down, which is not really convenient. And again, because it's a half cage, there's less mounting options on top. So you can see it's very limited. You have these screws and the cold shoe here. And the cold shoe might even interfere with what you attach here. So for example, if you attach a screen here and you wanted to attach a microphone on the cold shoe, they might interfere with each other. So you have to attach something to make sure that the screen sits high enough not to interfere with the microphone, for example. Another thing which is not ideal about this cage is that the cold shoe doesn't have an anti-slip pin. So if you insert something and you push it through, it would drop out on the other side. Now, some people might consider this a benefit because when you're rigging out your camera, you want to sometimes be able to insert something from the front as well as on the back because one of the sides might have been blocked by something. But I think in the case of a half cage, on a small camera, anyone who uses a half cage on a Micro Four Thirds camera would probably not be rigging out too much. So I think having an anti-slip pin on the cold shoe would be an advantage. Also, it could be optional. So if it's a screw, you could just unscrew the anti-slip pin, and for people who don't want that. So what you can do now instead is actually get a cold shoe and attach it either on the left-hand side to these screws or maybe on top if you want a cold shoe which has a anti-slip pin with one of those levers, so you can just insert things and take them out. And the other disadvantage of this cage is that there's no NATO rail on top. So you can add a NATO rail on top, but again, that takes away from the options to mount things and it's additional weight again. And another disadvantage for this cage is that you cannot detach it without removing the lens. So if your lens is reasonably big or not even that big, I mean, this is the Olympus Zuiko 8 to 25 millimeter lens, and I cannot remove the cage when this lens is on. So I have to remove the lens first and then take the cage off and then reattach the lens if I wanted to. So there's less flexibility in that sense. The main advantages of this cage is that it's a half cage, so it only weighs 120 grams. So depending on how you use the cage, some of the disadvantages that I mentioned might actually be compromises that are worth making because of the smaller size and the lighter weight that you carry on the camera. So since this only weighs 120 grams, you can think of it that you add an attachment for 120 grams and you have an additional mounting point on top in addition to your cold shoe, and you won't have to utilize the cold shoe on the camera to damage it. So you can attach a top handle here and microphone here, or you could attach a NATO rail or whatever else you want, or a monitor here, without impacting the cold shoe of the camera, and by only adding 120 grams to what you need to carry. So this is the only camera cage for the OM-1 and the OM-1 Mark II. So irrespective of how good or bad it is, there are no other options. But I would like to see an update to this cage to make it a dedicated cage for the OM-1 and OM-1 Mark II, so that compromises don't have to be made. So the first thing I would change on this cage would to have a fixed position for the screw so that it doesn't play. And also I would add a M2.5 screw here and something to connect it to the cage with, and I would make the camera rotate less inside the cage. Also, I think they could make use of the protrusions, the feet of the camera, if you want to call them that. There's like a 1 millimeter protrusion on 4 edges of the camera. So if they make this half cage dedicated for the OM-1, then they could make use of these protrusions. Even if it's just one of those protrusions, it will still help to stabilize the camera and make it sit lower onto the cage. So it would be a nicer fit. Anyway, let me know if you have any questions about this cage or if you want me to show it on another camera such as the EM1 Mark III.